It began like any other family get-together. The type we've all attended hundreds of times before. My sister Claire had planned a little party for her youngest, Dylan, who had just turned 18. And it turned out to be the most bizarre, but personal, and thrilling night of my life. The house was filled with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of silverware as people helped themselves to slices of cake and refills of drinks. Dylan had always been a quiet kid. But over the last year he'd grown into himself, taller, more confident, and surprisingly charming. The house was buzzing with guests mingling. And Dylan was making his rounds, thanking people for their gifts. My husband Greg was in the living room with my brother-in-law drinking beers and discussing something to do with football, while I found myself drawn to the kitchen for a moment of quiet. The kitchen was a sanctuary in that house. I'd always loved it. The big windows let the sunlight spilling in, making everything feel warm, comfortable. I busied myself washing a few dishes that had piled up, the hum of conversation and laughter muffled behind the walls. But as I wiped my hands dry and glanced around the room, I heard footsteps behind me. "Hey, Aunt Juice." I turned to see Dylan standing at the door with an almost shy smile on his face. "Oh, Dylan, how's the birthday boy?" teased, giving him a soft punch on the arm as he stepped closer. He chuckled, leaning against the counter beside me. "I'm good. It's a bit overwhelming. Though I guess I'm not used to all the attention." There was something different about him, I noticed then, his eyes, the way they lingered a little longer than usual. Or maybe it was the way he stood closer than he normally would. I brushed the thought away, chalking it up to him just being more grown up than I remembered. We chatted casually for a few minutes, talking about his plans now that he'd graduated from high school, his summer job at the local coffee shop, and his hopes for college in the fall. But there was an underlying tension in the air. Maybe it was just my imagination, but something felt off. Still, I ignored it, thinking nothing of it. Then, as we were about to head back to the living room, Dylan shifted his weight and his voice taking on a quieter tone. "Aunt Juice, can I tell you something?" I paused. There was something in his voice that made me stop and look at him properly, really look at him. In his eyes weren't those of the shy boy I'd watched grow up. They were intense, almost troubled. "Of course. What's on your mind, Dylan?" he asked, running a hand through his hair. A gesture I recognized from his younger days when he used to get nervous before asking for something big, like an expensive toy or staying up late on a school night. "I don't know who else to talk to about it," he said, looking down and avoiding my gaze. My stomach twisted slightly with concern, but I tried to keep my voice light. "You can talk to me about anything you know," he said, nodding, but he hesitated for a moment, as if he was having trouble finding the right words. The seriousness in his expression made my heart race. He said, and I froze, not understanding what he meant at first. "Dylan, my nephew, the boy I'd babysat, helped with homework, and watched grow up, was standing in front of me telling me he was in love with me." I finally managed to get my voice shaky. "You don't know what you're saying." But he didn't back down. His eyes remained locked on mine, full of a sincerity that both terrified and confused me. He spoke in a low, almost whispery voice, saying, "I've been in love with you for a while now." But I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. The ground felt like it had moved beneath me, and all the sounds from the other room seemed to fade into a dull hum. "Aunt Juice, I know exactly what I'm saying. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I didn't want to make things awkward, but I couldn't keep quiet any longer. For a while, I felt like I couldn't talk, and my mind raced as I tried to figure out how to react to his words. This wasn't real. It's not right. Dylan." I shook my head and stepped back, placing the counter between us. The look in his eyes and the way he spoke unnerved me. This wasn't some childish crush that would blow over. He meant every word. "You're confused. I'm your aunt. For God's sake. I know how it sounds, but I'm not a kid anymore. I'm 18, and I know what I want. Dylan, you must realize that." I started to struggle to find the correct words. "So I had to end this before it got any worse. Your family. You're like a son to me. You need to move on from this, okay?" He didn't move. Instead, he looked down, his expression clouded with pain, and for a moment I felt an ache in my chest. But this wasn't about me. This was about stopping something that should never have started in the first place. But even as I said those words, I knew this wasn't over. I thought once I told Dylan to move on, it would be over, that he'd take a few days to clear his head, realize it was just a fleeting emotion. and we'd return to normal. But I was wrong. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next few days were strange. Dylan didn't come around as much as he usually had been close even after he grew older. He would drop by the house for dinner or call me if he needed advice on something, but after that conversation in the kitchen he disappeared. And his absence left an odd emptiness behind. Still, I thought it was for the best. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he needed space to come to terms with what had happened. I figured time would help him sort out his feelings. But then one evening my phone buzzed. Dylan texted me. "Is it possible for us to speak?" A part of me wanted to ignore it and act as if nothing had happened. But I also felt obligated as his aunt to support him and make amends because, after all, family didn't abandon one another during difficult times. Against my better judgment, I said, "Okay, come." As I gazed at the screen, feeling pleased. After 7 p.m. tomorrow. Greg, unaware of the storm brewing in my mind, had gone to a friend's house for the evening to watch a game, leaving me alone with my thoughts and soon with Dylan at precisely 7 p.m. The following day went by in a blur of anxiety as I was unable to focus at work and found myself pacing the house nervously, wondering what I would say when he arrived. The doorbell rang. My pulse quickened as I walked to the door. Forcing myself to stay calm, this was just a conversation, I reminded myself, just a chance to clear the air and help Dylan move past whatever this was. But when I opened the door and saw him standing there, something felt different. He wasn't the awkward, unsure boy I'd spoken to in the kitchen. His posture was confident, his gaze steady, and there was an intensity in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. "Hey," I greeted him, my voice shaky. "Hey," he replied, stepping inside. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension between us that hung thick in the air. I led him to the living room where we both sat down for coffee. Table between us, the silence was suffocating, and for a moment neither of us knew where to start. Then Dylan broke it. "His Aunt Juz, I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice soft but sure. "I've tried to forget what I feel like you told me to, but I can't." I opened my mouth to interrupt, to tell him this was crazy, but he raised his hand, gently cutting me off. "Please just listen." Reluctantly, I nodded, though every fiber of my being screamed for me to put an end to this conversation before it went too far. "I've been in love with you for a long time. This isn't something that just happened yesterday. I've tried to move on, fight against it, and think about it, but I can't stop my heart from racing. Dylan, I know this is wrong, and you think I'm confused, that this is just a phase. But it's not." That his eyes were fixed on mine without wavering. "You're just 18. I'm no longer a child," he said, shaking his head gravely. "You've only begun to experience these emotions, but they will change." His words astounded me. Dylan had always been mature for his age, but this time there was a gravity to his tone, a certainty that unnerved me. I had expected him to be awkward and confused, but instead he was calm and determined. "This isn't just about what you want," I said, my voice firmer than before. "There's more at stake here. I'm your aunt. We're family. This is not possible. I am aware of its complexity." "I know you do," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "I saw it in the kitchen. You hesitated. And then, just like you're hesitating, now I'm standing up quickly, needing to put space between us." "Dylan, but you can't tell me you don't feel something too," he said, his voice steady. For a moment, I was paralyzed, unsure of how to respond. And that tiny hesitation was enough for Dylan to see right through me. "You're my nephew, we can't do this." But rather than retreating, he got up and took slow, deliberate steps to close the distance between us. "Aunt Juz, I don't want to hurt you or make things awkward, but I can't keep acting like I don't feel what I feel. And I know you feel it too, even if you don't want to admit it." My hands trembled as I backed away from the living room, feeling much smaller than they had just moments before. Dylan stopped. "This isn't going to happen." His fingers lightly touched my arm, and I froze. There was a softness in his touch, a vulnerability that prevented me from moving. He whispered, "I'm not asking for anything from you. I just need you to understand." For a long, agonizing moment, we stood there, neither of us moving, the silence between us thick with unsaid words. "I apologize," he said, "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice barely audible above a whisper. I couldn't keep it inside anymore at that moment. I didn't know what was going through my body. It was in a split second that I let my guard down and I kissed him. Now that I think back on it, I still can't put my finger on why I did that. But I feel like it's because he finally admitted it came from both sides. It was a small kiss before we paused. And after that, it turned into an explosion of emotions. Felt so good. And I knew he felt the same, but then he pushed me away without another word. He turned and walked out of the house, leaving me standing there. My heart racing. My thoughts spinning at the sound of the door closing behind him was like a gunshot, and I sank down onto the couch trembling. But as much as I wanted to believe it was over, I knew deep down it wasn't. There was more to come. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Even after Dylan left, the weight of his words lingered in the air, thick and heavily. I sat on the couch for what felt like hours, replaying the conversation over and over again in my mind, hoping that, if I thought about it enough, I'd make sense of it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't untangle the mess of emotions that had woven themselves into every corner of my mind. For the next few days, everything felt off every time my phone buzzed. My stomach dropped, expecting another message from Dylan. Every knock on the door made my heart race. I dreaded the possibility of him showing up again, yet a small part of me, one I hated to admit even existed, was almost waiting for it. Greg noticed something was wrong. He wasn't one for asking too many questions. But after a week of me being distracted, distant, and jumpy, he couldn't ignore it. "You've been quiet lately. Jules, is everything okay?" I forced a smile to dismiss his worry as we sat down to dinner one evening. He looked at me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly, but he didn't press the issue. I felt guilty because Greg was a good man, and here I was, caught up in something I couldn't even explain to him, that had no place in our lives. Days turned into weeks, and Dylan didn't get in touch with me again. Family get-togethers became awkward because I felt his absence like a shadow hovering just out of sight. Dylan was there, of course, but we hardly spoke, and every glance we shared felt meaningful. And I couldn't get rid of the feeling that everyone else could sense the tension too. It was at one of these get-togethers that things took a turn I hadn't anticipated. We were at CLA's house again, this time for a laid-back weekend barbecue. The weather was perfect, sunny and breezy, and everyone was strewn about enjoying the day. Greg was away with my brother-in-law again, talking about sports as usual. I needed a moment away from the crowd, so I wandered into the kitchen to get a drink. I thought I was alone, but as I opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water, I heard the door creak behind me. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat when I saw it was Dylan. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway, his eyes unreadable for a moment. I considered walking past him and acting as though we hadn't seen each other, but I was stuck. When he did speak, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Aunt Jess, I need to talk to you." My heart thumping, but I made myself stay calm. "Dylan, now isn't the time. I am aware that there are people outside, but this must wait. I've tried to stay away. I've tried to forget everything that happened, but I can't," he continued, moving farther into the room. Dylan and I discussed this as I stepped back and felt the chilly kitchen counter against my back. "How do you feel?" I pretended not to feel anything as I answered. "It's not real. It's just confusion," he interjected in a firm, unchanging voice. "I've been thinking about it every day since that night, and I've been trying to figure out how to move on. But nothing works. I still have the same feelings." I shivered, panicking because you're making things more difficult than they need to be. "Dylan, this isn't right." He drew forward, bringing us closer together, his gaze intense. "I don't care about what's right anymore. I just want you to know that I love you. I've loved you for a long time, and I can't just act as though I don't know." His words shocked me and left me frozen. This was wrong on all levels, but the way he said it made it difficult to think clearly. My chest was tense with the weight of everything I didn't want to feel. "Dylan, stop," I said, barely able to speak. "You have to stop this." I told him to stop to prevent that I would let myself go again. "I can't," he replied, his voice just as soft as "I don't want to hurt you. But I can't stop how I feel." He reached out, then his hand gently brushing against mine. I flinched. pulling my hand back, but the warmth of his touch lingered on my skin, sending a wave of confusion through me. This wasn't happening, it couldn't be happening. You don't have to say anything, he continued, stepping even closer to me, closed my eyes, trying to block out the weight of his words. The closeness of him, the memories. I didn't want to acknowledge. Dylan, please. But even as I said it, I knew this conversation wasn't going to end the way I wanted it to be, that I could feel the tension in the air pulling us together, and it terrified me. And then, just as I was about to speak again, the sound of a door opening echoed through the room, startling us both. Greg's voice drifted in from the hallway. "Juice, you in here?" Panic shot through me, and I quickly stepped away from Dylan, putting as much distance between us as I could before Greg appeared in the doorway. A smile on his face. There you are. CLA's looking for you outside." I nodded, forcing a tight smile as I grabbed the water bottle from the counter, my hands trembling slightly. "I'll be right out." Greg glanced between me and Dylan's, smile fading, as he seemed to sense the tension in the room. "Everything okay here?" "Yeah," I replied quickly, too quickly. "We were just talking about college, Dylan's plans for the fall." Greg looked at Dylan, then back at my, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "But he didn't say anything, all right?" I followed Greg out into the yard, trying to force the entire encounter from my mind. But I knew deep down that things between Dylan and me were far from over, and that the story wasn't yet finished. "Well, don't leave CLA waiting," I said, nodding once more as I felt the weight of his gaze as he walked back out of the room. Dylan didn't say anything, just stood there watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I was in a mental haze for the next few days, barely able to concentrate on anything. Dylan's words kept coming back to me, and every time I considered how close we had come to something I didn't want to even acknowledge, I felt sick to my stomach. I knew I had to end this, to draw a clear line that couldn't be crossed again. But every time I tried to figure out how to say it, couldn't. One night, while I was lying awake in bed next to Greg, who was sound asleep, I heard my phone ping. I looked at the clock and hesitated for a moment. But then I reached for the phone, my heart already racing, and saw that it was from Dylan. "We needed to talk. I can't continue in this manner. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. at your place." I was torn between fear and responsibility as I stared at the screen for what seemed like an eternity. I knew that meeting him again alone would only cause more problems and confusion. But I also knew that if I didn't go, nothing would be resolved, and that this situation couldn't be ignored indefinitely. Reluctantly, I typed a response that said, "Okay." Just before 3 p.m. the following day, the doorbell rang. My hands were clammy, my pulse racing as I scanned through the window who it was, but of course I already knew it was Dylan. He looked tense, his shoulders hunched as he stared out at the water. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever conversation was about to happen, and opened the door. There he was, a young, vibrant, and very handsome. "Hey," I said softly. "Hey," he replied while immediately stepping inside. For a moment neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, the weight of everything we hadn't said hanging heavily over us. "I can't do this anymore, Aunt Juice," Dylan finally said, breaking the silence. "I can't keep pretending like I'm okay. Like I can just move on and forget everything." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dylan, I understand this is hard for you, but we have to move on. We can't stay in this place. It's not healthy for either of us." He shook his head, frustration and pain flashing in his eyes. "You don't understand. I can't just switch off my feelings. I've tried, and I can't. And I don't think you can either." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm your Aunt, Dylan. We're family. What you're feeling isn't something we can act on. It's not just about us. It's about everyone else too. We would destroy so much if we crossed that line." He turned his head. "I know it's complicated. I know it's wrong. But I don't care. I can't keep lying to myself." The intensity of his words hung in the air between us, and I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest. I had to make him understand that this had to stop once and for all. We both sat down at the couch and continued the conversation. "Dylan, listen to me," I said, facing him. "I care about you. I love you, but not in the way you want me to. Have to let this go for your own sake." He looked at me, then his expression softening just slightly, and for a moment I saw the vulnerable boy I had known all his life. The one who had always looked up to me, who had come to me for advice and guidance. "Tell me you didn't feel anything," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. That night in the kitchen, tell me you didn't feel anything, and I'll let this go. I felt the world tilt slightly beneath me. I wanted to say it, to give him the answer that would close the door on this whole mess. But the truth stuck in my throat like a stone. I had felt something I couldn't explain, something I didn't want to admit to myself. But I couldn't let that truth slip out, would only make things worse. I wanted to lie, but before I knew it, I told him the truth. I told him what I truly felt for him. If I am honest, I did feel it, Dylan, I said, my voice barely audible. It was a mistake. But I did feel the excitement through my body. His face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he might argue, but then slowly he nodded, his eyes filled with a deep desire to go back to that one moment. I could just feel it, and suddenly I felt the same. I knew I was the person that was in control, and so I leaned into him and grabbed his chin. I kissed him once again. Once again, I was the person that started the drama. I just couldn't hold it this time. We both didn't hold back. And we let ourselves go. As I was going with my hand through his hair, I felt something I had never felt before. It was so exciting. So wrong. But yet so exciting. And then before I knew, we went way further than what we had already done. It was a crazy moment, and thinking back on it, it is all a blur for me. But yet something in me craves to get back to that moment eventually. As we done, and still both lying on the couch, I told him this was a big mistake and that we couldn't tell anybody. He told me he was truly in love and that he wanted more of it. But I told him I didn't. As I was grabbing my clothes, okay, he whispered, if that's how you feel. He turned away from me. Walking a few steps towards the window, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of everything he had been carrying. I wanted to reach out to comfort him. But I knew I couldn't. This be something he had to come to terms with on his own. After a long silence, he finally spoke again, his voice low and resigned. I'll move on. I'll try anyway, but I don't know how long it's going to take. I nodded, my heart heavy with guilt and relief. You'll get through this. Dylan, you're strong. You'll find someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. He didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there staring out at the water, lost in his own thoughts. I waited for a moment longer, unsure of what else to say before turning to leave, but just as I started to walk away, I heard him speak one last time, his voice barely more than a whisper, I'll always love you. And tears stung my eyes, but I didn't turn back. Couldn't. I walked away, leaving Dylan behind on that bench by the pond, knowing that we had both been changed by this in ways that neither of us would ever fully understand.